what do you think are Steiner's key insights in terms of not just the understanding of the child, but of the human being altogether?
I think he's given us a foundation for penetrating the connection of mind and body, of psyche and soma, of consciousness and substance, in the sense of metabolic substances. Steiner was a monist. He didn't split the world into two parts and say one part is mental and another part is physical. One part is conscious and another part is material. For Steiner, matter and spirit worked together. And if there was anything going on in the realm of cognition, in the human being, at any rate, is connected with a metabolic process. Now, that doesn't mean that you can reduce consciousness to the materialistic picture of substance that we have, but neither does it mean that consciousness is something that's floating around somewhere. Neither does it mean that consciousness is produced by the brain in the way that, say, red blood cells are produced by the bone marrow. But all these images that with which we struggle to understand consciousness end up being dualistic. And Steiner insisted on seeing the same thing from 2 points of view. And his approach to medicine, as well as child development, really bears that out, and enables us to see an awful lot of things that are going on psychologically in terms of their physiological correlates. And movement, I suppose, is an example of that. It's a movement. The way we move is a bridge between the metabolic processes that underlie movement and the gesture, the consciousness, the drives, the awareness that movement clearly embodies. Does movement come from consciousness, or does consciousness come through movement? It's neither the one nor the other.
Yeah. What then is one to make of Steiner's utterances about life after death, when we clearly don't have a physical body?
I think for Steiner, the life after death wasn't going somewhere else. I think it was acknowledging a continuing presence within the same world that we are otherwise living in, but at a different level of being. The organs of the body, for instance, the liver, the kidney, the lungs, the heart. I don't see these organs as merely instruments of physiological function, but I see them as the homes of spiritual beings, of living spirit and soul beings. We don't see them in the ordinarily understood sense. So I don't see the spiritual world as something out there, but in the mysteries of the heart, which have never been better understood than now, for instance, equally well of the kidney and the liver. But the heart is perhaps a special organ in this respect. In the mysteries of how the heart functions, of the coherence of the heart, the fact that the heart is now fully recognized as the most sensitive sense organ in the body. It's certainly not a crude pump pumping the blood round. It plays a unique role within the circulatory system as an enhancer of movement and as an organ of coherence, I would say. But equally well, we can begin to be aware that the heart is also an organ of our consciousness. Cardioneurology is a subject in its own right. There's a lot of work being done on that in America, in the Heart Math Institute, for instance, which is quite remarkable.
How much is Steiner's work known about and respected in the medical world, generally?
I think I would have to say nothing like as much as I would have hoped, or that I feel it deserves. On the other hand, what I would say is that science, not just the neurosciences, but science as a whole, with its increased sophistication, possibilities of, highly complex brain scans, perfusion studies, all the manner of things that nowadays are possible, is bringing forward evidence that those of us who have lived and worked for many years with Steiner see as confirmation of what Steiner has said. I somehow feel it's up to us to be able to often interpret what is arising nowadays through scientific research, and perhaps not to be too concerned whether people recognise that Steiner had anticipated it in one way or another. Of course, in Steiner's time, biological sciences were very primitive. I don't even know if there was a real concept in his day of the immune system, and therefore he couldn't, or even the endocrine system. So he couldn't speak in language that would nowadays be regarded as scientific, but he was able to see into a field. So, for instance, he said that an endocrine gland,
what is that?
An endocrine gland, a secretory gland like the thyroid or the adrenal gland, is a kind of an extension of the brain into the metabolism. Well, that's an imaginative picture. What do you make of it? But when you appreciate now that the brain is a neurosecretory organ, and that there is a connection between neurotransmitters and hormones, and that the hormones secreted in the body also have an influence back on neurological development. So there's a kind of conversation going on between metabolic processes through the glands and the brain. You can immediately see what it was that Steiner was getting at. But in a way, there's no point in then saying, well, Steiner should have got a Nobel Prize for it. But nevertheless, in many areas, some of his insights medically as well as scientifically were clearly way ahead of their time. One could give examples of that. He mentioned lead poisoning, for instance. He mentioned the relationship of fluoride to the teeth. There were many, many, many connections that he made which have since been substantiated. But I think that it's our job to be able to use what he said to make more of current science.
Do you feel that the word spiritual is confusing, even misleading for people today?
It varies enormously. I think in many ways it's much less confusing than it was when I started my career 30 odd years ago. I think many people appreciate that by spirit one doesn't mean something floating around supernaturally, but one is referring to the creative core of a person, the self. In psychology, for instance, in psychospiritual or even transpersonal psychology, the terms self and spirit are often used almost interchangeably, because the character and the nature of self, I think, is increasingly recognized as having something quite unique and separate from its biological basis. Of course, in saying that, I'm in a way falling prey to my own dualism, but it's difficult to get round these things, isn't it? Yeah. So I don't personally feel constrained by the use of the word spirit in my own work. I find that people generally know exactly what one means. Of course, you can't use the word in a scientific environment. You have to find other ways, but that's not always so difficult. I think what's more problematic with Steiner's vocabulary is that he did adopt words that were originally derived from a kind of Eastern theosophical context. So much of his medical writings, and not only, also the educational, do use terms like astral body and etheric body, which were the terms that he had, out of the necessity of his own biography, inherited and they were the terms that people were familiar with who were asking him the key questions. And he said, for instance, in his lectures to young doctors, I wish we could reinvent our vocabulary here, but we can't. So you just have to appreciate what I mean by what I say.
What is his picture of the human being? I mean, in language that we can relate to now. People talk about body, soul and spirit, but he's a little more scientific than that in a sense, isn't he?
I'm sure he was the first person to speak about body, soul and spirit in a holistic way. But he also spoke about how we are supported by the physical substance, how we have a functional body, what would nowadays perhaps be called an ecological body, in which the life is held, and a body of consciousness, a body of sentient awareness, which we share with the animals, and then this unique capacity to self-reflect, to observe the very process, the very activity that is going on within oneself at any given moment. We can disidentify from our body, feelings, mind, and who is doing the disidentification. That's the self, and that would be the gateway to the spirit and the bridge between spirit and body. And Steiner also connected these different functional systems which interrelate. They're not separate, but they're only separate as far as our thinking is concerned. He related them to the classical elements as described in ancient Greece and in other earlier cultures. So the actual mineral world, the fluid world, the aeriform, the air, the gaseous, and the fire or the warmth, Steiner reinstated not as mere descriptions of states of matter, but as conditions through which different systems in the human being were able to connect to the physical. So consciousness is very much sentience, consciousness, reactivity, sense perception is very much held within the gaseous element, the air element, and the life process is very much within the fluid body. And of course one can translate this nowadays into chemistry, because of course we know just how important the dissolved gases are in the body in relation to our consciousness. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and indeed also nitrogen. You know, our soul life, our consciousness life is intimately related with particularly the gaseous elements within us. You see that, for instance, in the way that stress is handled in the body. Nitrogenous products, nitrous oxide, are involved in the maintenance of blood pressure. The whole connection of something like high blood pressure, hypertension, with stress, which is a psychophysiological interrelationship, which I think everyone now recognizes, and which has so much to do with the kidney. These connections Steiner pointed to long before the detailed physiology of the kidney in relation to renin, angiotensin, nitrogen metabolism, carbonate secretion. All these things were known. He also, he made statements such as that much that goes by way of heart disease today and enlarged hearts should be seen in terms of kidney pathology. Well, people would stare at that at the time and not know what he meant. Nowadays, the relationship between the two is well established, and much of heart pathology is treated via the kidney. I think what this points to is that Steiner's insights were looking for physiological verification. He wanted this. He always said the spiritual researcher can show the direction, But the scientific researcher has to corroborate this, show that it holds together. And from a certain point of view, Steiner was born much too early, because the science of his day, the instrumentology, the investigations, simply couldn't do what he was needing on any level. Nowadays, he would have been working with the scientific researchers in a much more active way than was possible in his time. Therefore, inevitably, I think, a split arose between the general approach of the anthroposophical doctor and the approach that conventional medicine took. And I think that nowadays we're all really working at cross-referencing here. We don't want there to be such a thing as anthroposophical medicine. We want there to be medicine. But a great deal that Steiner has said and addressed can take hold of and make much more sense of medicine as it is. So, yes, we have to maintain something of our own identity, because it's not possible for the two streams to flow together instantaneously, but the direction we're working is one of integration. And certainly in the practice of medicine nowadays, there is no way that an anthroposophical doctor can isolate himself from what's going on out there in the mainstream. It's impossible.
James, what about the nature-nurture debate? I mean, that's a kind of cliche almost, that these two factors explain, as it were, why we are. Now, where does Steiner's insights come in that sense?
I mean, nature would nowadays we would see very much in terms of genetics, I think. And nurture is sense perception, environment. I think one of the most illuminating fields of modern research is epigenetics.
Which is?
Epigenetic regulation, for instance. It's studying the relationship between the effect of sense perception and via the nervous system, obviously, how that can influence which genes become active, the whole balance between the stimulator and the inhibitor genes during the developmental period of life. You see, Steiner made an outrageous statement in this field, which we've all been staring at for a long time, with, I think, on the one hand, realizing, yes, what he's saying is right in principle, but how on earth can we justify it scientifically? The statement was that by the time a child is 7, he's overcome the forces of his inheritance. He is a genetically different individual from the person that was born. Well, of course, DNA testing doesn't exactly confirm that fact. However, what we are now aware of is the extent to which our genetic inheritance is not determining how that will necessarily manifest in our life. It will depend upon how it is regulated, particularly in the early years of childhood. And that's epigenetic regulation. And there is a particular window of opportunity for this, particularly in the first 3 years, but I think it extends a little longer. And it also works between generations. So how a child deals with the environment now and what comes towards a child may not necessarily have an immediate effect on the genetic expression of that child, but may in subsequent generations come through. So back to your question of nature and nurture, they work together. The given, the genetic material that is given is far more malleable than our traditional science of genetics would have thought in the past. Far more open and malleable to sense perception. And of course, this emphasizes just how important the early years of childhood are in terms of establishing genetic pathways and in terms of salutogenesis, in terms of health promotion.
But in simpler terms, am I right in thinking then that we are not totally determined by our genetic inheritance on the one hand and the sort of environment in which we grow up on the other, that there is another factor which exists already before we're born? I mean, that's the implication, isn't it?
Yes, that's very much the implication, that what we meet in our environment is not actually arbitrary, no more than what we meet in our body is arbitrary. And the two are not as disconnected as our dualistic consciousness might imagine. There is perhaps even a lock and key relationship. So how does one understand that? One can imagine a kind of unifying system, if you like, at a higher level that is linking and integrating environment and body.
But again,
and I mean, to put it in dualistic language, the human self, the human spirit, pre-exists birth and exists after death. The spirit is at work before birth, both in the building up of the body and in the building up of the environment. Both. This is, if you like, the story that Steiner is offering us. Perhaps it's a parable. We can't take it too literally because the language in which it's expressed is earthly language, and it's talking about something that transcends the earth. But I think the essence of it is that we are not simply arbitrarily placed here on this planet, the victim of our genetic makeup, or for that matter, the victim of our environment, but that there is a part of us which is the architect of both. And that is the part that awakens in our consciousness as self. We may not be aware of it, but an increasing number of people nowadays often are. You know, people do have not only near-death experiences, but experiences of birth and pre-birth memories. This is well known and well established. Also, you know, all the work that Jung did around the theme of coincidence, you know, the outer event matching the inner process. This is confirmation of the fact that we don't simply live in a cause and effect relationship to the outside world, but an ecological one, that there is in fact a coherence between the two. Now, we can call that coherence the third factor that transcends the nature and the nurture, but works through both. I think that would be one attempt to describe something that is in its essence transcendental and transpersonal. I think Barfield would have called it noetic, I think.
And it's this, what you call third element then, that in a Waldorf school they are also, as it were, addressing and nurturing. Would that be right?
If you hold an awareness of this third element in terms of an attitude, in terms of an approach to the child, I think that your possibility of empathy increases, and I think that your capacity to be there to serve the individual nature of each child is enhanced. I think it helps to build faculty rather than holding was it Aristotle who said education has more to do with lighting fires than filling buckets? You know? Well, if you're talking about lighting a fire, what are you talking about? Fire, warmth, spirit, self. And the spirit in the child needs to be seen. The spirit needs to be heard, seen, recognised. A child's neurology mirrors being seen. The act of being seen is vital for the inner stimulation of the child's biopsychology. Even to the extent that there are neurons nowadays identified called mirror neurons. And I think they have something to do with, their activity I think has something to do with autism or the autistic spectrum.
But in a sense, all of us, not just children, are hugely influenced by
Sure.
how other people perceive us. As it were, not just seeing outwardly, but a sense of what we are or might become.
Yes. And this is vital in terms of an approach to education, because if you concentrate solely on weighable and measurable outcomes, then you already have a mould that you want that child to fulfill. You can hold that as part of your picture, but there is another half, there is another part there. What's seeking to emerge, what's seeking to unfold, because a human being doesn't just replicate a species in the way that an animal does. A human being has this unique capacity to unfold something new and creative that will make a difference in the world fundamentally. But that depends upon the human being knowing that they are valued, that they are important. So a child-centred education is from that point of view vital.
That's very well expressed. Should we tackle reincarnation and karma?
By all means.
I mean, how does that play into your work as a doctor?
Well, I certainly don't claim to be able to trace illness or happenings in this life to former lives, and neither do I see that as my task.
For yourself or for your patient or both?
For both, generally speaking, but the way that you carry, if you see a human life as a segment of a much bigger process, then it enables you to appreciate that the mission or the destiny or the motivation that lives in a child is probably an activity of will that is carried over from a former life, that there is something there of a mission that was perhaps in a former life only able to come to a very provisional fruition or expression, and is now being given an opportunity to go further. And I certainly hold the picture that before we're born, we take stock of what it is that we're here for, and that we then, at the end of our life, as is indeed often described in people who've had near-death experiences, meet the question, what have you done with your life? Now, no human life can ever fulfill its entire potential. It can only be a fragment, a part. And for me, I find the idea that is one fragment among many very helpful. But of course, it's not the personality that reincarnates. It's that invisible entelechy that we're calling self that is able to self-observe. It is a part of the universal self, it's a part of the universal spirit. And I think that through reincarnation and karma, the spirit is evolving through human beings. A remarkable statement Steiner once made is that human beings are the religion of the gods. Another way of putting that is to say that the spirit, that through the spirit in the human being, the spirit in the universe is also evolving. And that in the course of evolution, human beings are in this sense co-participants in the divine. And within every individual human being, there is a divine spark. For me, the picture of reincarnation and karma supports that, makes it more coherent, more intelligible. And one would then be able to look upon even illnesses as possibly a part of the resistance that we have to meet in order to fulfill our potential, because resistance in life is vital. You know, without resistance, psychology talks about optimal resistance. If a child isn't given resistance, nothing develops. It's the same with muscles, isn't it? You know, muscles need resistance in order to develop strength. Psychological muscles need resistance too, and sometimes in our lives we have to meet resistance and pain in order that it will eventually bring the best out of us. And that is nowadays in the medical field, we call that self-regulation. The ability of a human being to be aware of the resistances of illness and to take account of them and assume responsibility within them, rather than expecting medical science to just do it for you. Because however much medical science indeed can and does do, it's the self-regulating activity that is probably the health-promoting activity. If you want to make a person ill, you disempower them. You put them in an environment in which their ability to feel that they matter is worn down. And it's the worn down person who has no longer any sense of the ability to change the environment that they're in that will die. It's the spirit that remains inwardly active and responsible under adversity that survives the concentration camp. And therefore this is seen increasingly as the most important health promoting factor. Antonovsky's work in America bears that out.
James, one of the sort of stumbling blocks for people if they come across Steiner is how can somebody know these sort of things with that sort of exactitude and certainty? It's even quite off-putting. I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, in the first instance, I think it's a matter of living with the facts as you perceive them and coming to terms with the facts, isn't it?
What facts?
Well, Steiner's work is so all-encompassing, so transdisciplinary. It spans so much that we would assume that it's unrealistic that any one human being could have brought so much forward. And indeed, many people have said if Steiner had just specialized on any one field, he would have become the Einstein, the Freud, or whatever of that particular field, given that he was interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. He could never achieve that status. That's true. But it is remarkable that a human being is able to say so much from the point of view of what he himself calls spiritual cognition, spiritual perception. You can only live with it, and live with it with your own questioning mind, and see to what extent it makes sense. and that's what he asks us to do. Probably most people dismiss it because it doesn't appeal to easy digestion. That's for sure. To really work, to really get to grips with Steiner, you have to work hard, very hard, over years, over decades, and gradually something of where he's coming from conveys itself, and a sense of integrity and confidence in this person grows, not because you're believing in his authority, but because there is a coherent interrelationship between what he says in one context and what he brings in another, and also because you will be looking for substantiative evidence in the fields in which he's speaking, and also the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Waldorf education has its results, as does anthroposophic medicine, as does biodynamic farming. Now, how, if that fact increases one's awe and respect for what the human spirit is capable of, that can only be a good thing. And Steiner had a particular capacity, which, and he came at a particular moment in evolution and culture, at that moment when the 19th century materialism was in a way falling away, but when the modern world of science and technology was beginning. He stood at that critical point also at the time when psychoanalysis was in its infancy, but it was already launched. But this amazing time at the beginning of the 20th century, and maybe he could only have lived at that time and brought forward what he did in the way that he did then. It's no answer to your question. It's an attempt at a response.
Steiner did, of course, indicate that these faculties that he was drawing on were potentially in all of us.
Yep.
I mean, that's important, isn't it? Because it stops one putting him in some sort of ultimately unhelpful box.
Well, Steiner, of course, said a very great deal out of his own, let's say, spiritually intuitive faculties, which perhaps nobody since has been able to say in quite that way. But his message was to everybody the capacity to come to spiritual insights is latent in every single individual person. And the path, the most important thing, is that each and every one of us finds their own access to that development, and it will be a different access point for different people. Phenomenology of the natural world, cultivating the ability to truly observe nature. As, for instance, Denis Kloczek is exemplifying, Craig Holridge, people I think you've already spoken to. These are individuals who are developing, and to a degree have developed in their field, a kind of reliable perception of phenomena that could be termed spiritual, following in most cases, the indications that Steiner gave. And Steiner also gave us simple but nevertheless quite arduous exercises to do in order to develop intuitive insights, even quite apart from developing anything vaguely resembling clairvoyance. So taking a child, the perception of a child, how they've spoken to you, what's lived on in your perception of that child into the night in sleep, and then noticing what you wake up with in the morning in relation to the child, can awaken a capacity of of practical intuition, which he suggested teachers developed. And indeed, this, something very similar can happen with a doctor or a therapist. One doesn't have to achieve the stage of clairvoyant perception that Steiner himself obviously had done in order to be a spiritual researcher and in order to take further what he said. And I think that particularly in the last 20 years, the amount of secondary literature that's appeared from people who've been influenced by Steiner but have done independent research is extremely impressive. Steiner expressed in a verse the concept of the interrelationship of the macrocosm and the human being. And if I remember rightly, it says, in the free human being, the whole universe is gathered up. So with the free resolve of your heart, take your own life in hand, and you will find the world. The spirit of the world will find herself in you. I think that was the particular way he framed it in this particular meditative verse. One can't prove such a thing. It's not a scientific statement, I don't think. If by science you mean something that can be quantified. But if the spirit of the world, if the universal spirit that is out there, spiritual, physical, neither matter nor spirit, but that which underlies both, if that spirit is evolving in its own very existence through human beings, then it follows from that each human being has to be an inner kind of, has to have a representative, is a drop of the ocean, represents something of that totality. Now, Steiner was often very, very crude and simple in the way that he said things. When in his lectures to the workmen, for instance, he said, well, the hairs on our head are like the grass on the fields. He made comparisons which, from a certain point of view, seem very simplistic. But when you live into them, they're not necessarily simplistic. The stars in the sky relate to the neurons in the brain. Why not? How many stars are there in the sky? Has anybody tried to quantify it? It's probably an unquantifiable question. It's probably an unquantifiable question, how many interconnections between neurons is it possible to have in the brain? In effect, it's not quantifiable. These are imaginative pictures which, if you take them seriously, can deepen your relationship to who you are and how you relate to the world, and can overcome alienation. Part of the problem nowadays in depression is that the human being feels powerless and alienated so often from the environment. If we live with the picture that what's out there in the universe also lives in us, and we can bring it to an expression in every thought and every deed, then that can give us a sense of our own worth. It can stimulate our initiative. It can bring out the best in us. Whereas a picture that just shrugs its shoulders at the whole thing tends to bring forth cynicism. I think we have to distinguish really between what Steiner gives as living imaginations, which an individual person may fruitfully live with, and, if you like, facts that are in the literal sense true. Steiner works with both, but we have to know when he's doing the one and when he's doing the other. So this picture that the human being is a microcosm of a macrocosm is at least in the first instance an imagination to live with and to explore. It's an avenue into a meditative approach to the world. Steiner said, for instance, imagine that our sense organs, our eyes and our ears, are like the source of a river in the top of a mountain. And then imagine that our muscles and blood are like the salt water of the sea. And imagine how the water in the springs is connected to the water in the sea and recycles. And in the same way, imagine how what we take in through our sense perceptions enters into our blood and muscles and inspires our action and our will, and then goes beyond us, because our actions that we put into the world are no longer bound up with ourselves. They then have their own life and fate out there in the world. That's in a way like the water returning to its source. It's a cyclical picture. Now, living with pictures like that connects the scientificness of the fact with the feeling, and it can stimulate initiative. And these pictures can live fruitfully, not in the sense are they true or are they untrue, but what do they release and unlock within the human being. They also depend very much on the way they are taken up, the mood, the soul mood. And this is where I think for Steiner, the scientist, the artist, and the religious person flowed together. They weren't, science, art, and religion were not for Steiner three different things. The scientific fact should engender a response in the feeling and should invoke an awesome feeling in the will, which is of more of a religious character, let's say a respect. And there is then a kind of cycle from the one through the one to the other. Gaia consciousness nowadays speaks into the same theme. An appreciation that the universe that we live in nurtures us and has the quality and character of the mother. This is an expression of the picture that we are children of the universe, that we're not just objects that have evolved in an arbitrary way, and that we belong together.
Last question. The film's called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner. What do you see as the essence of that challenge?
Steiner challenged us to take our own thinking very, very seriously. He challenged us to think way beyond the logical framework of what's inside the box, but to make connections in our thinking which we could continually test. The challenge of Steiner is to uphold the freedom of the individual human being and to awaken in each of us a sense of our responsibility for not just for the future of the planet physically, but for the evolution of this matrix in which we find ourselves, this firmament, as Shakespeare called it, to evoke a sense not just of connectedness, but of co-responsibility. And in the challenge of that path, we have to meet also our own limitations and our own potential for evil. We have to meet, in other words, our own freedom. We can't just replicate what we've been told, but something has to be reborn in us because we will it so, because we think it so. I think that's perhaps the ultimate challenge, to help to bring human beings to the point where we can sit round a table together and say our collaboration is in the service of the universe as we know it, we can change, we can make a difference. And he's given us a unique set of tools to approach that if we resonate with them and take them up.
You haven't used the word God.
This universe that we live in is God. I don't want to postulate a hypothetical God, but the material world of which we are part is in its essence divine substance. I mean, that Steiner was quite clear about. Substance, silica, calcium, magnesium, carbon. These are the clothing of the body of God. And God is that being through which all these substances find their ultimate sublimation. God created the substances, and they've come to rest just for a short while in order that human beings can find their freedom in relationship to them. And I think at some future point we will all go into a kind of process together again. The world that we know won't be here in this form forever. How can it be if it's in evolution? You know, the sun's life is limited, the earth's life is limited, but does it all stop when the outer manifestation falls away? This is the ultimate existential question for human beings, isn't it? Can you disidentify from the manifestation and still retain a connection to the sense of being? And I think for many people, God is that sense of being. The ground of our existence through which we experience our own being in the world.